So I'm here to cheer you on. So I'm here. So
Yeah.
yeah, I just wanted to let you know that, if you have any questions or anything, you could just reach out to me, get a hold of Taylor. And anytime you want to come to campus, come by.
Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah, and good luck.
Thank you.
I'll hang in the background.
For those of you that have already joined us, thank you, and we'll get started in another minute.
I'm showing we just switched to 4 p.m.
All right. We'll go ahead and get started, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the brand new installment of our weekly Discover Archaeology webinar series. My name is Susan Ryan, and I am the Executive Vice President of the Research Institute here at Crow Canyon. And it is my honor to have Will Carson with us today. Before I turn it over to Will, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping here, so just bear with me, Will, for a couple of minutes. All right, first, we're going to switch slides here if I can and talk about Crow Canyon. So for those of you that are brand new to Crow Canyon, our mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and also American Indian knowledge. We absolutely have an incredible website that has amazing resources on it. If you ever want to explore our website, you can get lost in there for ages. Please come look us up. Look at what we do. Support our mission. We are located near Cortez, Colorado by Mesa Verde National Park, and we're a nonprofit research and education center. Also, you are very familiar with Zoom and Zoom technology at this point. One thing you need to know is if you have questions for Will during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section, and I'll be checking those throughout the evening, and then asking Will the questions at the end. We hope to get to all and as many as we can, and so get them in there. We look forward to your questions. If you have any difficulties, we have a live stream going also on Facebook. So you can go to crowcanyon.org/Facebook to join the live stream. And then if you have any interest in watching our past webinar series for several years now, you can go to Crow Canyon's YouTube channel and watch the recordings that we have. We've got one per week for almost every single week of the year for the last several years. They're extraordinary as resources, and there are a variety of topics and presenters. So I hope you will do that. All right, we're also going to do an acknowledgement statement. The Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apaches people on whose homelands we reside and work. At Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold because of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. We seek paths that support and align with Indigenous peoples and communities. With gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and colleagues with whom we partner and who we have helped to guide our mission work. Next, if you haven't been following, we have blog posts also on our website. You can find those at crowcanyon.org/news. And the latest blog post, called David, Goliath, and the Battle of the Museums, is by yours truly. And this one is around the struggles between our national repository, the Smithsonian, in the late 1800s, and the desire for local National Park Service museums to pop up. So this is a picture of Mesa Verde National Park, and that is the focus of the latest blog post. So please take a look at those. All right, next we have upcoming webinar events on Thursday, April 17th at 4 o'clock Mountain Time. we have a webinar on powerful pigments, unearthing the enigmatic Fremont red on gray pottery with Scott Ure. And then on Thursday, May 1st at 4:00 p.m. Mountain Time, we have Nuwu Astronomy Views with Autumn Gillard. Those look like great ones, and I hope you tune in. And then also, Kuro Canyon would not exist without your support. If you go to our webpage, you will see all the various ways in which you can make donations to continue to help support the mission work that we do and to bring incredible presenters like Will Carson to our Discover Archaeology series. So you can scan the QR code or you can go to our website to look for ways that you can help support Crow Canyon's mission. And finally, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce William Carson. William is a member of the Oyenque, one of the 19 Pueblo tribal nations in the state of New Mexico, and he's a fourth-year doctoral candidate at the University of Arizona, majoring in health behavior, health promotion, with a minor focusing on Indigenous law and health policy. He is also an adjunct professor at the Tohono O'odham College, teaching Introduction to Public and Community Health. William's research interests are focused on the mental health implications of blood quantum-based enrollment laws. Will also assists with research around cancer care support, cancer health education, urban Indigenous health policy, and Indigenous data sovereignty. To better understand Indigenous students' healthcare utilization habits at the University of Arizona campus, Will's dissertation research focuses on how Indigenous identity and tribal enrollment interact with healthcare applications. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and that way Will can go ahead and put his up. And Will, it's an honor to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us, and you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So, going to walk. So, sorry, I am just a little nervous, but that's okay. That's part of the fun. So, before I get into it, I just want to say one thing real quick. So, Onvia Gindi, Navi Owakawa, Huata Dimu, Navi Mati, Kanakawa, William Carson Dimu, Na O Oke Owinge, I Oemu. So, hello everyone. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Like I said, my name is William Carson. I am a member of Oke Owinge. I am also a doctoral candidate here at the University of Arizona, where I'm currently, speaking. I'm speaking from, our land sits on the homes, the current and ancestral homes of Tohono O'odham Nation, as well as Pasquayaki tribe. Both have lands in and around Tucson. And I am sitting and actually giving a lecture from the heart of the Native American community here at the University of Arizona at the Native American Student Student Affairs in one of the offices they have here for students to be able to work and study from. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you guys a bit today about some of the research that I've done. And like it was said, we're going to really go over some of the challenges in which we as Native people face in the fact of the continued use of blood quantum. And while it says historical, I really want to just briefly touch on the historical aspects because there are just truly outstanding work at fields, from people who have done far more work than I have that really touch on like the actual historical intricacies. One of the people that I really want to shout out because of the work that I've seen from her is Jill Dorfler, who has an incredible book on the subject. I highly recommend that because it really goes into some of the things about how blood quantum really was just such an unknown and abstract concept that it really makes you think about how really everything kind of came to be. But I really want to go into kind of like where I stand as a healthcare researcher and why there seem to me that there's challenges in how we apply our current work and our future, what we go into going on, and where I hope that my research can kind of lead me as well as the other researchers, native and non-native, in the future. So before I go into any of that, I think it's always very important. At the beginning of most of my papers and things, I try to have something called a positionality statement. Positionality statement, it kind of is basically, if you don't know what that is, it's basically just kind of telling you, it's like, this is who I am, and this is why what I say, shouldn't be just immediately discarded. So, this is something that, whether or not you have heard of it, but if you are a native, if you have done native studies and things like that, this is a pretty common area. Blood quantum very commonly hashed. It's rehashed, it's discussed, it's argued about for everybody. So it's like, who am I? Why does it matter? Why should I really, why should you take into account everything I say? And so that's what I want to do right now. I want to tell you who I am and why I might have a perspective which, is valuable. So this is me right here. This is my wife. And this is our son right here. So I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate, like I said, it's a behavioral health promotion, member of Oyenque. But one of the things that I think is very important to point out is, as you can tell, I am a mixed race individual. So my mother is the person who comes from Oyenque. My dad is a 6'6" giant white guy, born in West Virginia, played football at Ohio State University, and is currently a researcher and chair at Texas A&M University. So I have always, and because of his research and position as a professor and in that academic work, I have always lived in urban areas, moving around as I go. So I was born in Houston, Texas. Just like my siblings, though, we were all enrolled at birth into our tribe. After that, we moved to South Carolina, and then I grew up, and then I played football and got my master's degree at Columbia University in the city of New York. And after that, I completed a fellowship working with the Centers for Disease Control's Public Health Associate Program, which unfortunately is currently under fire right now. Current PHAP associates were told in February that they were no longer allowed to work. They were being terminated. That was reversed for a bit, and now their jobs are currently again under fire. I love to read as well. I love to read. I have read like 25 plus non-academic books so far. I just got finished with a wonderful reread of The Count of Monte Cristo, one of my favorite books of all time. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it just because it's like one of the greatest stories of revenge ever put into paper. It's very readable. It's very wonderful, even though it is like 1,300 pages. And like it was said, I've done research. One of my main interests in my life has always been just blood quantum. For the longest time, that was how Oyenque determined our enrollment criteria. When I was born, the process for enrolling was relatively simple. My mom and my dad just signed some documents, mailed that out to the tribe. We were above the blood quantum threshold for the tribe, which was 1/4. We got enrolled, and that was kind of all there was to it. So for a long time in my family, we were, enrolled for that way. That was just how we knew who we were. That was kind of our connection. And for a while, for a lot of tribes, that is kind of the stopping and short of that. So that was always something to me, but it was always also in the back of my mind, two things. One, you are right at that cutoff. So are you truly that native if you are simply at the cutoff for the criteria for your tribe? And then also, what happens, and this was a question that I had as like, a little elementary schooler who was learning fractions. It's like, well, I'm growing up in South Carolina. I don't know any other Pueblo people here. So by the math I can do in my head, if you half 1/4 and you drop below that criteria, well, suddenly you're 1/8 and you're no longer eligible to be enrolled in the tribe. So I guess for me, I internalized at a very early age that I guess this is kind of it for my line of Tewa people. I guess this is just kind of where it ends because that's kind of what the rules state. My son, or no, any of my future children will no longer be enrolled. So that's just kind of it. So that was always just settled in the back of my head from a very early age. And I never really considered it again until I met my wife. And my wife at the time I met in New York City. We met and hit it off real well. She is, as you can tell as well, not from Oyenque. She's actually French. So comes from a completely different world than us. And it was really wonderful to be able to go over there, be able to be part of that. And that was just something there. And for the longest time, I never even considered it. I never even bothered to think about, okay, what would be like the consequences of, going back, and what would this mean for, my family and my position within my community. If I wanted to come back, if I wanted to work with my tribe, what would that do for my family? Never really considered it because, it was just so abstract. It didn't really even matter to me. The only time it really started to hit me is after we got married and we found out we were having a kid. Now, when you find out you're having a kid, it's supposed to be this wonderful, joyous, exciting time, especially when you have planned it. And that was true, but immediately after that, I was like, wait a minute, what is this supposed to mean for my kid? And that really caused a lot of stress, a lot of unwanted issues, and a lot of unwanted stress for me. I was like, if my son can't be enrolled, then he's going to have to see me for my entire career talk about the importance of, Indigenous identity and the not, there's not really this, foundation of like blood quantum and how it really matters. But while I believe that, and while many people agree that blood quantum is kind of this arbitrary concept that's done by colonizers, if you can't enroll, then there is certainly a position there. There's certainly a challenge there. And so that was something that we really had to consider. It was only after I had talked with my aunt at the time and found out that, okay, we can change our enrollment laws to now be much more focused on, learning how to become part of like the community and, take steps to be, a good member of the community, through like dissent and other steps that you have to take, that this type of pressure went off me immediately. And I truly could not thank them enough for this, because one, it invigorated me to go on to this path continuing, but also to know that this is a thing that I would really like to continue going forward and doing research in, and being a better member of my pueblo, not just saying that I'm a member of it, but actually actively learning how to participate and have my son grow up in the culture as well as best I can. Other things I do focus on Indigenous data sovereignty. It kind of ties into the blood quantum work that I'm going to talk about. And then also like urban Indian healthcare policy. So trying to help students, trying to help people from urban communities get better access to healthcare, get better access to culturally relevant care centered by like urban Indigenous organizations, or like, organizations that can encourage like, better communication and all that. So this is why I came back to school. I came back to school because I couldn't see anybody in the sciences really discussing the potential impacts of blood quantum on things. And so this is a paper that I was able to put out right before my dissertation, which I believe kind of centers the work that I am hoping to do now and then going to work in the future. So now that we kind of went into that, and I know it was a little long, now I want to just talk about some of the challenges and the agendas we have today. So we're going to go into some historical challenges. We're going to talk about some of the contemporary issues. My work we're going to go into, and then we're finally going to talk about something very relevant to me in the past, that's really emerged in the past several weeks, which is the war on diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI in universities, and how that can impact one of the most important places for young Native students who are learning what it means to be good members of their tribes away from their communities, and what that could potentially lead to some unexpected consequences for Native communities as well. So first of all, what is blood quantum? Who did it? Why did they do it? So historically speaking, we can see some of the, a lot of academics and researchers and historians kind of agree that some of the most early experiences of blood quantum were implemented in 1705 in colonial Virginia to deny the rights, basically civil rights, land rights, everything like that for Black, Indigenous, and mixed folks through legislation. And the quote right here kind of is pretty telling. So they actually don't just go through the fact of like, well, they actually went out and defined who is Black, who is Native, who are these mixed folks. And, that if they meet this criteria, then, they have less rights than, other folks within the colony. So any of the child of the Indian and the child, grandchild, great-grandchild of the Negro should be deemed accounted, held, and taken to be mulatto, which meant, again, like they're just legally trying to figure it out. And that's kind of the first type of idea of like a blood quantum really existing. Is like, okay, so anybody who is considered 4/4 or 1/2 Native, they're suddenly, seem to have lesser rights. Additionally, we have things done with the federal government when they were trying to determine how many natives they had after the Indian Wars. Original use of the reservation system was first, prison camps, try and determine how many natives there really were, because then if you have treaties, if you have these obligations on hand, they were, trying to then figure out, okay, how few people do we really have to acknowledge here as truly Indian? So then we don't have to give them land and everything like that. So Dawes Act of 1887 is kind of similarly one of the things here to be, impacted here. So, you had to be above a certain threshold. In this case, it was 1/4 to be eligible. And land that was set aside for Native Americans was then to be, if you didn't have enough people who met this threshold, or for a variety of reasons, it would lead to a loss of land. And so you wouldn't deserve land if you do not meet their criteria. And it wasn't something that was set up and determined by tribes at the time. It was actually just something that was set up by the federal government at the time. So federal government would be the judge, jury, and executioner for this operation. And that is why you saw a lot of these original base roles for these types of tribes not be eligible. As you can see here was the Dawes Commission for 200,000 applications for the 5 tribes in Oklahoma. Only 101,000 were accepted. And a lot of the people who were rejected immediately were people who, for any particular reason, a lot of people who are, mixed with Black folk, you would have people immediately rejected for that because, you can't be Black and Native at the same time, according to the feds. Another thing would be that people, if they necessarily were, didn't look Native enough, they might be rejected. If you simply didn't, show up and, be counted, you might not be accepted. But also white folk could actually apply and buy their way onto roles to, be considered Native as well. That was a thing as well that we could see. And so final thing I just want to quickly touch on is the Indian Reorganization Act. It was something to help encourage tribes to develop their own constitutions and everything, and but as part of it to get access and regain access to some of the materials and everything that governing materials, governing or districts and legislations and all that for tribes, they were encouraged as well. Encourage is a way that I would say, but very strongly emphasize blood quantum to be the way that you count your people. And so, yeah, another thing I want to talk about because I was so fascinated by it at the time is a state level thing. So in 1924, something that's been very well documented by a lot of different folk is a 1924 Racial Integrity Act out of Virginia. And what that essentially did, it was led by a man, I believe, named Joseph Plecker, incredibly racist person. And what they basically did was they went from, so at the time, the U.S. Census was carried out at the state level. So the state of Virginia decided that there was no need to count non-white people anymore. There's, there was only 2 races in the eyes of many of these eugenicists, which was white and those who are non-white. So at that point, you had seen through legislation and through the census, a denial of acknowledgement of Native populations within the entire state. So you had gone from tens of thousands of Virginians who were indigenous at the time in the 1920 to then by 1940, the only indigenous people left on the rolls for the U.S. Census of Virginia were white folks who had been able to, claim indigeneity for their own particular reasons, whether it's, for whatever particular reason they may see, just, convenience, notoriety, some of the spice of life type of nonsense there. So that's kind of the really old, the older things, the older basis of blood quantum that we kind of know and understand today. Some of the things that I find very interesting and I get kind of nervous about now is kind of the Supreme Court's kind of opinion for some of the folks on it who view tribes and indigenous peoples maybe as being people that belong to the past. So some of the things here I would like to talk is 2 specific Supreme Court cases: Rice v. Cayetano and adoptive couple versus baby girl. And I'm not really going to go into the actual details of the cases too much because they're not necessarily about, like blood quantum and things like that, but the ways in which the Supreme Court in their decisions and their majority decisions kind of have like a disdain or, the still belief that you can breed out the indigeneity of, folks within the United States is certainly on there. So one of the things about the Native Hawaiians, for example, one of the reasons they don't have federal, rights such as in American Indians or Alaska Natives in that way is in part somewhat due to this Supreme Court case right here, that because their treaties and their agreements went back to the 1700s, that indigenous people could show their ancestry all the way back there. That also meant that, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, that their, livelihoods and their, part of their ways of being and their culture now were also America. So while they were potentially an indigenous people, they didn't have the same rights as, say, those on the mainland. For the adoptive couple and baby girl, one of the current sitting justices, one of the most staunchly anti-indigenous people, in politics today, Samuel Alito, began his entire case ruling against Cherokee Nation, which is classifying that why are we even doing here and talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act when this this adopted girl is neither enrolled within her tribe and also only 1.2% Cherokee. Like, why do we care about what the Cherokee Nation's tribal enrollment laws say when it's only an arbitrary, it's a very marginal number of person who is Cherokee here. So, and to me, it's not so much that that type of thing is really super alarm, but it's to me that it says, like, as long as we play the game of blood quantum, as long as we continue to play these rules with the rules that the United States really wants to play, we run the risk that eventually that the United States will just throw up its hands and say, well, let's see your roles. Let's see how many people truly look, just as Donald Trump has said, how many people truly look Indian over there. And maybe they'll just go through another extermination period. That's certainly something that is always on the mind for me, especially as we continue down this path with our rules. So one of the things that I want to talk about now is, where are we? So how many tribes still utilize blood quantum? How many of them really utilize this type of stuff? And so one of the people that I have great respect for, Desi Small Rodriguez, as part of her one of her dissertations for one of the PhDs she has, she actually did this incredible amount of research working with over 250 tribal nations and offices to try and figure out what exactly their enrollment laws were. And what she had found out is that about, of the 250 out of that 574 federally recognized, 167 have blood quantum, 90 have a national lineal descent, and a few folks have something that is different. I know that they classify lineal descent as non-blood quantum, but there are things that I have personal critiques about that, but not too much. The only thing I'll say is, like, it's like, while you say it's not blood quantum based, how many tribes that implement lineal descent, such as the Cherokee Nation, for example, in Oklahoma, also will continue to record blood quantum. So just as Samuel Liedel had pointed out in this thing, is like, there's no reason for that person to, have the ability to say that, oh, this person's 3,256. Well, they don't use blood quantum, so why are we collecting it? And why are we saying that that person is 2 out of 356 when, if they're eligible, they're eligible? So those are the questions that I have for that. But this was a wonderful study, and I highly recommend looking into more. She does some absolutely fascinating stuff. Some of the things that she found is that there is a relationship between blood quantum and if your tribe has a gaming casino. Same thing with, I believe, per cap payments. But one of the things that I think was really pointed out, and I wanted to emphasize here, is that for these other two studies that she utilizes here that go into this this data, they utilize data directly from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And when she reached out to try and get the same data, she had actually, found out that they said that they don't collect that type of data anymore. So whether or not the Bureau of Indian Affairs actually continues to maintain some kind of forms of data, to help, to monitor the tribal enrollment laws of tribes, we're not entirely certain, but they used to, but they say they don't anymore, and we're not really sure. So that's just the kind of thing there. So we see a variety of different types of blood quantum on here, blood quantum laws throughout, but most of them, 167, the vast majority, 1/4 is seen as a pretty fair, 1/4 Indian blood as well. Those types of things are potentially fascinating. So a lot of tribes still utilize blood quantum for their things. And a lot of tribes, as I'm going to talk about, utilize blood quantum in a way that weaponizes enrollment as a way to increase potential costs of things. And so that would be disenrollment. So disenrollment, as we discuss here, is, basically weaponizing the idea of the fact that there is there's potentially money at stake with people being in charge. So one of the biggest causes of disenrollment is actually, potentially per cap payments. And per cap payments are, payouts from various enterprises within a tribe based on, the total population you get. So theoretically, if you have a population, if your tribe is going to pay out $5 million, you would be more incentivized to then, have less people. So, like the people with the higher, blood quantum would get more money. So it's a kind of a contradictory thing where a lot of folks are anti-disenrollment. A lawyer, for example, like the name of Gabe Galanda, he opposes this very much on that fact because like it goes against the whole idea of tribal sovereignty, everything like that. Nation building, for example. And so yeah, so sorry. So that's the kind of challenge there is like, what kind of nation would, limit its own, population to the point where, so that way it can profit and gather things. And while my tribe doesn't necessarily do per cap payments, and many do. And that's something that, they have to debate. They have to have their own reconciliation about. It's not necessarily about a thing, but it's just about like, if you don't have that type of thing, maybe you want to consider it going forward. So I brought up Gabe Galanda because I actually had a question for him because it was a hypothetical at the time. And my question was, instead of going for this whole thing of disenrollment, so slashing people off rolls for not meeting a certain blood quantum criteria, what if there was an example of a tribe who, say, raised the blood quantum of everybody? What if some tribe just decided out of the blue one day that, say, like, they have a whole bunch of people that, their enrollment laws say that everybody above 1/8 can be enrolled. So they have a ton of people who are 1/8, 1/4, 1/4 full, but they also have a lot of people who are, 1/16, 1/32 that can't be enrolled. What is to stop a group like that to then say, you know what, actually going forward, everybody from like, everybody from our role who is on that role is now considered to be full-blooded, 4/4. And so that was a question that I had. And I thought it was a completely hypothetical thing. I was like, okay, this clearly would have legal challenges. That the federal government would say, no, you can't do that. And I got an email basically within the hour saying, oh yeah, this has happened before. Red Lake Tribal Council did that. They actually did exactly what I just said. And so they had decided one day after much deliberation that as a way to continue their conversations on what exactly the process and the basis of the Indigenous identity will be and their identity here is, well, everybody in 1958 onward is now considered to be 4/4, which automatically bumped up a ton of people's blood quantum, made a ton of people more eligible for things, and it was a step in the right direction. It was a step in a direction to evaluate the purpose and utility of blood quantum going forward. And I just thought that was so fascinating at the time because I had never heard of a tribe simply saying, well, we're just gonna, you say we have to use blood quantum, so you know what, we'll have it, but we're just gonna, make it arbitrary. And I think there was a lot of thought at the time that, the feds would look into this and not be happy about it, but there was really no pushback. Tribes kind of were shown to see that they can raise or lower their blood quantums of the tribe as they see fit, which I thought was a very fascinating thing. Now, if every single tribe decided to start doing this, there might be some pushback at that point, but individual tribes choosing to increase their numbers this way is something that, is potentially a viable option. So that's something where we see. So we see this whole impact of blood quantum. We see people being disenrolled, unenrolled. We see all this type of relationship, and it kind of is a big issue for how does a person's Indigenous identity really impact their mental? How does this really impact our our psyches, our mental health? So that's something I wanted to see as well. So it's well founded that we have Native folks in the country have a lot of challenges compared to the general population, white population, and there's a whole lot of things you can link it to socioeconomic status, educational attainment, historical trauma, and there's a lot of things going on there. So how can and we see that in ethnic identity is a big thing in the public health world. We look at it among migrant populations. We look about different ethnic populations throughout the country, immigrant populations, first-gen populations, Indigenous populations, just to see how does a strong attachment to your culture impact you. And for a lot of communities, it's generally a protective thing. And so it's like, okay, so clearly that should be the same thing for the Native populations, right? And well, maybe. We've seen some interesting results for that, and I'll go into that a little bit further in a few minutes. So Indigenous identity, but some of the reasons we see some interesting results, so results that don't exactly match other populations, that Indigenous identity is not necessarily the same. Tribal critical race theory is a thing developed by Brian Brayboy in 2005. He is a Lumbee professor now, I believe, at Northwestern. The Lumbee are a state-recognized tribe in North Carolina, but have no federal recognition. So I believe this is something that is one of the reasons that he really thought about this for a long time, is that they have their racial identity. So you can be perceived to look like an Indian or look like a Native person, but you might not have the rights of other Native people based on your enrollment status, or simply the fact that the federal government doesn't acknowledge that your existence really is occurring. That's kind of what we see there. So federally recognized tribes have a certain level of rights and enjoy a certain level of things that say like state recognized, unrecognized Native Hawaiian populations really don't have. And then enrolled members have added benefits on top of that. So if you're an enrolled member of a tribe like that, you might have higher rights for certain types of things because you have a sovereign status as a member of a sovereign nation that is not the United States. So technically, when I go back and think about my son, because he's enrolled with Oyenque, he's American, and my wife is French, so he was born as well as a French citizen. He's a tri-national individual. So he has three different populations that he really identifies with. And the only thing I would add, and I think, because it is a 2005 paper, it is 20 years old at this point, you have your racial identity, so kind of like your self-perception, other people's perceptions of you. You have your political identity. The thing that I would say was also really important as a person who is from Oyenque, from a Pueblo tribe, where, our communities and our land is so intrinsically tied to who we are, how our community feels about us is also something that I would say is something that we should really consider about. So one of the things that I wanted to look into this is when I was trying to measure identity is like I was having trouble finding tools that really described the following thing, which is like, okay, so we can have racial identity and maybe your community attachment, but what are the tools that ask about this whole thing about, tribal enrollment status, your blood quantum, whether or not you're part of a federally recognized tribe, or what is it for like folks who are, from indigenous peoples from outside the United States who don't have those rights of people of American Indians and Alaska Natives. What do they have to feel like? And I couldn't really see that. So that's kind of where my next steps kind of attend. So I ended up going to do a scoping review for this very thing. Scoping review was kind of about, I wanted to know what is the relationship between Indigenous identity and psychosocial stressors. I wanted to know what tools people are using, and I wanted to know, where people are located and also what kind of theories are behind it. So what we ended up doing is the first part of my dissertation is going through 8,244 articles with a team of 2 other Native people, because I wanted to make sure that they were Native to understand that I didn't have to teach people about blood quantum or tribal enrollment status. It's just something that other people simply, by born and being Native and understanding it, just have an intrinsic understanding. So if you are Native, you have, however old you are, your experience with it. So I'm 30 years old. I am an expert with 30 years experience on blood quantum, basically. And that's true of basically any person who is Native within their thing. They are just simply experts. So we ended up going through 8,200 plus articles, found 24 articles and dissertations that really look at the relationship between Indigenous identity and psychosocial stressors in the United States. And what did we end up finding? We ended up finding a few different things here. So impacts of Indigenous identity on psychosocial, depending on the type of thing, we ended up having 3 big buckets. We ended up having a bucket that said, and they were all pretty split even down the middle. So 8 articles that said there's a positive relationship, so Indigenous identity can help prevent adverse effects. We had 8 articles that say Indigenous identity has a negative impact, so it hurts. It makes adverse effects more, pronounced. And we had 8 that said there's no relationship. And that kind of went into the fact of, going into like, the tools being used. So it's like we had a variety of tools used, but none of them really utilized Indigenous theory when they were going. They didn't really mention tribal critical race theory or any of those theories that really talked about identity as a really form of strength, but also like complex forms of identity with Native populations. We kind of just saw that people would adapt other tools for other populations in the United States and just go with those, maybe rename some stuff. So we had one that was like relabeled from like a Black identity scale. We had like a gender identity scale that was readopted. And then the most popular one was something called the multi-group ethnic identity scale. And that one's utilized by groups all over the country, but I'll go into some of my issues with that as we see here. So finer thoughts of this was, there's a need for more Native designed identity measures in the United States. We need things that actually talk about and incorporate things into the measurement that talk about blood quantum, talk about enrollment status, that talk about, these potential external political factors that also make up our identities and how they can impact, our general scores on these types of things. Our tools aren't really designed for Indigenous people, but we're having a lot more Native people in the field. So we should be designing our own tools to be using for these populations because we potentially get some better results. Maybe we won't get results that say mix things anymore. maybe we'll actually start to see some actual relationships. So it's published now. I'm very excited about that. First part of my dissertation is done, working through the second and third parts right now. And then that's my current research. So the current research, we just talked about aim 1. Aim 2 is to try and understand through talking circles, to understand what are some of the challenges that Native students at the University of Arizona have when they're trying to access healthcare here or within the region, and how does their identity as Native people really impact this? We also do surveys, and that's the second aim, or the third aim, and so we try to get a lot of stuff going through there. We asked questions. We ended up using the multi-group ethnic identity measure. Unfortunately, that was kind of the thing that I felt the best about because it was most commonly used. So we just ended up having to use that. And we've seen some interesting results as a result of that. So we've had 28 students through our talking circles and 153 completed surveys for aim 3, which we are genuinely excited about. And the best thing about those is like our demographic makeup really matched the current demographics as reported by the university for Native students. So we feel it's a very strong sample for what we really have. We couldn't have done that without many partnerships. So partnered with different types of groups on campus to try and understand this, because we as Native students have the lowest rates of healthcare usage on campus. So we were trying to work with our on-campus healthcare provider, Campus Health, Native American Student Affairs, which is our main center for all activity for Native students on campus, and Native American Advancement and Tribal Engagement, which is our main outward-facing group that really communicates with tribes, brings in tribal leaders to talk to people. Finally, I was funded by the Howry program, which is a group that works with environmental and resilience issues for Native populations in the thing. And so it was a really wonderful partnership. And we also ended up bringing in Tucson Indian Center, which is the urban Indian organization here in Tucson. And we're really trying to build out, okay, here's the results, here's the next steps. And one of the things I want to talk about with how do we measure Indigenous identity is the following page. And one of the things I just want to point out here is this is the main thing here. So I've had a lot of issues, and I pointed out that I don't like the multi-group ethnic identity measure. And one of the problems with it is that we see this, which is that if you see this, we split everybody up into tertiles. So 153 completed surveys, we split that up into, okay, the lowest score, the lowest third scores, the middle scored thirds, and the highest scoring third. They're basically almost identical. Like almost everybody scores very high on this. And so when you try to see if there's a relationship, you can't really see one because everybody's scoring very high on this measure. So why are they scoring so high on this measure? And when you look at it, there's a lot of questions here. I'm not going to leave it up here, but I'm just going to talk about it real quick. Because we're adopting it from communities who don't have to deal with blood quantum and tribal enrollment and all of that, there's no questions on tribal enrollment, blood quantum, and things like that. It's really just about how you feel you fit in, how comfortable you are, your identity as part of being in that ethnic group, whether or not you promote like different types of cultural practices for your ethnic group. And it's not really focusing on like, okay, how do I fit? And that's kind of where we get a lot of contentions and a lot of conflicts with how then students would then describe their own experiences. Because one of the things I'm going to show on the next few slides, if you guys want to read them, is some of the self-proclaimed challenges and difficulties that a lot of Native students who, for the most part, are active, and these are the most active students on campus that are actively involved with the clubs and the Native student clubs here and funded by NASA and ran at NASA and constantly sit here at NASA. And the challenges that they see in their own life and dealing with Indigenous and their identities as Indigenous people that don't really show up in this measurement. And I just want to go through some of those quotes right here. So Indigenous identity strengthens students. So I just want to read one quote right here, because this is the kind of thing where NASA is very important, where we might see Indigenous identity is very important here. So as I mentioned before, I'm involved in a lot of the Native American student associations, groups, and clubs. And so in that way, I'm able to surround myself with a lot of Indigenous people. I live in a dorm specified for Indigenous folks, and for the most part, I'm surrounded by Native people. And in that way, I feel like I'm able to maintain my identity. And we see that a lot. We see a lot of the people who are really appreciative of the space that NASA provides, whether it's also through like the Native-centered housing for undergrads, or the clubs that graduate students, undergrads can all participate in, or the space of just, studying at NASA. That's all things that really, really strengthen a lot of folks. And then I just want to tell you the next slide, because these are the next slides that really bother folks who are like, that I want to just talk to you about while I'm talking about this. And while I'm talking about this, and you guys want to read about it, go ahead. But one of the things I really want to emphasize with this is that a lot of time when we talk about blood quantum, when people think about blood quantum and who it really impacts, we think of the folks who are maybe like me, who are maybe or, even lower blood quantum than me, who are, below eligibility to be enrolled in their tribe, or people who are right at that cutoff, that the people who are mixed, that those are the people who are really most focused about blood quantum. Those are the people who are really most thinking about it all the time. But these are folks who, are enrolled in their tribes, I would say, like, if you go on to the University of Arizona and you see them in person, it's like, yes, that is one of our incredible native students here. Those are the people who are also feeling this pressure, and those are the people who really feel like they see these numbers and they're just like, well, why does this really impact me? We see people who, because of legal technicalities, that they're not able to be called 4/4, they're instead slash theirs because of legal technicality, and it really sets them in, it really bothers them. We see people throughout my research really talk about the fact that, dating and relationships, when you get into those and when you're very happy about them, they really impact you. And, it's like, are you even being a good member of your tribe if you're dating outside of your tribe and you're on that cutoff, or you're threatening to decrease the blood quantum of your future children, or, making more likely that your future grandchildren won't be able to enroll? And those are the types of questions that really go on in a lot of people's minds. And I was very fascinated to find that out. The other thing that we see is that there is this pressure. There is the pressure for people on the cutoff, the people who may or may not be eligible, but we also see a very opposite and equal pressure for people who are considered to be 4/4, higher up, 3/4, everything like that. If, like, the more native you are, there's an expectation upon you at that point to be the best representation of your tribe. That for something that you have no say over because you are it, then you have a lot of pressure to be a better person, a better representative of your tribe. There's questions that you might not be able to ask, that you're just expected to know. The people who, whether or not, they come to you, it's like you maybe might be expected to know your language fluently. Other students might just come to you and have questions about stuff and you're just kind of expected to answer. And that creates its own pressure about, like, how much do they really want to have this, and how much does that really impact them in terms of wanting to know more and coming back and being a good member of their community while they're at college when they don't have to deal with it as much. So those are the types of things that I really noticed in my research that I think are very important. And they create this challenge, and they create this, complex, set of things that, because blood quantum is there, it creates a relationship that we really have to think about. And we have to think about both the people who are ineligible, but we also have to think about how does it impact young folk who are, have a very high blood quantum, and what kind of expectations they're set for themselves, and people who are around them have expectations for them as a result for that. So that's the things I want to discuss. Finally, I also want to discuss the war on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, in universities. Why does this matter? Well, one of the things I think matters about this is that, for the most part, at most universities in the country, Native populations, Native organizations, student groups, student affairs, everything like that, they're all centered in DEI right now. So we don't necessarily, now you might have scholarships, tribal scholarships, other things that are directly funded that only can be applied for by people who can verify their tribal enrollment status or everything. But for the most part, our spots, such as NASA, where I'm sitting in right now, are open to everybody. We don't discriminate for anything. We allow people who are enrolled members. We allow people who can prove who they are. We allow people who are unenrolled. We allow people who are simply allies. We allow people who, may or may not, think that they have a, family, and they're still trying to research that. And as we kind of discussed before, because of the federal meddling in so many base roles, there are many people who very well might be parts of tribal nations and don't really, are still trying to just do the research to see if it's even true. And so right now, university spaces are a place for folks to foster, their identities as Native people, grow, learn more about their identities, and continue to grow and become better parts of their communities, whether they want to go back to their tribe, whether they want to work with urban populations or nonprofit organizations, or become professors themselves and work on Native issues. It's a wonderful place for fostering things. And what's happening right now is the opposite. Right now, the University of Arizona, where I am, is attempting to destroy 6 out of the 7 cultural resource centers on campus. So that would be the ones for, Black folk. It would be the ones for the Latinx populations. It would be for women's studies, LGBTQ populations. the Asian and Pacific Islander one, as well as the Disability Resource Center. And they're going to get rid of them and merge them into one thing because DEI efforts are no longer possible. Now, the thing about Native populations that we might be saved from that, but if we're getting rid of DEI, what is that going to make, colleges and Native spaces on campus? How will that change our inclusivity? How will that change our way to encourage that we are getting as many people, as many minds as possible into these areas and having our students grow and learn from each other, and having people who maybe, weren't the loudest speakers, early on, how are that going to happen? Because like I said, right now, all of our stuff doesn't really discriminate. We don't really look at the people who are, enrolled. We don't really look at that type of thing. But from my own research, there is a hesitancy to use these spaces by certain Native populations there. While sent spaces like NASA are undeniably beneficial, they're only beneficial if people show up to them. And even now, people who are mixed race or people who, might, be like many, high blood quantum, but not really be culturally so in tune as others, are currently like a little hesitant to use these spaces. But then once they get here, they're very happy. And they, really grow and have their Indigenous identity fostered. But if we make these places more exclusionary, if we make these places less DEI based and more based in the fact of tribal enrollment status and everything like that, what will that do to discourage people who are trying to learn about themselves in a time where, if you're at a university setting, it's one of the first times in your life where you can really be, you're really growing into who you are and finding your voice. What is that going to do? And, there's some very real consequences that could happen if we really comply. And that's something that I'm really worried about going forward. It's something that's really come up only since we've kind of found out that there is this very real opportunity for this. So that's kind of all I have. Right now, I would say my final thoughts are that, historically, we know the basis of blood quantum, but that doesn't really, but just saying that it's a colonial construct, I would say, takes away some of the responsibility of the current tribal governments we have. Is that, yes, it's a colonial construct. Yes, there may be some force by the federal government to continue having blood quantum, but at the end of the day, it is our decisions. And our young people really have pressure on them because of these arbitrary numbers attached to their names. And so if we are interested in continuing to persevere and be here for hundreds of years in the future, then we have to take responsibility and evaluate this. And so I hope that my work, that in the future, when I develop tools to help show that, the actual impacts of things like blood quantum on Native identity, I hope that we can do that and show that there is some kind of, relationship there to better inform tribal governments to then have these laws really be critically evaluated and potentially changed. So that's the kind of thing there. So Kundawaha, thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to take some questions. And then here is my works cited.
William, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. We have time for some questions here. The first one has to do with that there are 574 federally recognized tribes, and each of these tribes is responsible for creating their own concept or ideas around what enrollment should be. The US federal government does not create that for them. But that being said, we have so many government systems that were put in place that rely on tribal membership to have access to certain things. For example, healthcare, employment, grants, or even enrollment in some cases. Do you think there will ever be a world in the future in which the certificate of degree of Indian blood cards aren't necessary or aren't even used anymore?
So I think that's one of the actual things there. And I know that's a line of the federal government, but I simply don't really believe that. I don't believe that, while they say that ultimately it ends up at the hands of the tribal governments and that how they determine enrollment status, the federal government has so many obligations and things for even using their own criteria and using their own materials. Like they have certain blood quantum thresholds themselves for if you're eligible for certain preference things. So I believe some of their requirements are like 1/4 for some of their jobs. So, and while they don't necessarily, control some of these enrollment decisions, What they do have is if you have a constitution and you have it through like the BIA, through that act I talked about, the BIA does have discretion to review any changes to that constitution. And while it's mainly just like a just pretty simple approval process, because they have that discretion, there is opportunity for them to maybe say like, no, if you want to alter your if you want to alter your enrollment status in some way to make it very radical, make it something that isn't lineal descent or make it something very unique, they might say no. And one of the things I have about my tribe is that we don't have a constitution with the federal government. So, and I'm not sure, I don't believe that the Red Lake has a constitution either. They have a constitution, but it's not through the BIA. And so we do have a little bit more leeway in that regard because we don't have to get authorization every time we want to make a change. So I would just say that is like, yes, tribes do have authority, but when you hear the idea that, oh, well, federal government stays out of it, it's maybe. I think that's still up. I think that's still up for debate because we still, if you see some of this most modern research, we don't have radical change in terms of how tribes enroll. Most of the tribes have basically the exact same laws, and they kind of fit into two things, which both kind of rely on base rules. You have lineal descent, which doesn't have a cutoff for blood quantum, or you have blood quantum laws. But both of them track CBI, certified degree of Indian blood. So how different they really are, I mean, I don't know. It's like we have lineal descent at Oyenque, but I still know my blood quantum. We still track that. I still know my son's blood quantum, and we still track that. So those are the types of things I would say are some differences there.
Okay. In the year 2020, 9.7 million people self-identified as Native American, which is more than twice that was recorded on the 2000 census. How can we, as the average census takers, distinguish between political, cultural, and racial identities?
Sure. So I think one of the most important things about the census is that for some reason, the federal government chooses to have two very different things have the exact same name. So American Indian and Alaska Native is used in two entirely different ways. And basically, so like federally recognized tribal nations are called, American Indian and Alaska Native. They fall into that category. That being said, the census does not measure enrolled citizens. As a matter of fact, I don't think there is any type of depository that anybody collects in the United States that knows the exact number of enrolled citizens. What instead you have in the census is self-identity, but even the term American Indian Alaska Native doesn't mean the same thing. So for American Indian Alaska Native on the census, what it actually is a catch-all term for any indigenous identifying person from the Americas. So you might see a ton of people, you might see that spike. And it's not necessarily, it might be in part due to the idea of like a rapid number of people, doing their DNA tests and finding out that they're like, some percentage native. But most likely that's not really the thing that's driving it. What's really driving it is we have a lot more immigrants into the country who identify as indigenous populations from Central South America, when that's one of the big things that's driving our indigenous upswing there. We have a lot more people feel uncomfortable about identifying as a Native American, but we also have a lot more just indigenous people in the country because so many more people are claiming refugee and asylum status, and we're counting them now. In New York City, for example, there's over like 120,000 indigenous people in the country, in the city, within the 5 boroughs. But a large percentage of that is non-American Indian Alaska Native. They come from all over the Americas. So I think that's kind of one of the big differences, is that we don't really know how many enrolled citizens there are of the tribal nations, of the 574 tribal nations. And I would say we don't need to know, and we don't want to know. We don't want to know. We don't want the federal government to know that number. But the other number is the one where we get a lot of issues and a lot of contentions and all that, is it's self-identity. They may or may not be self-identifying with the tribal nation like Cherokee Nation. I know they have a lot of people within the Cherokee Nation, but a lot of folks are just identifying with, who they know they are. They might not identify with different nations. Yeah.
Okay. Our next question comes from Dr. Catherine Williams, and she says, "Thank you for your excellent presentation. Have you found any trends between identity and spatial proximity to community, So much of the move away from blood quantum seems connected towards a move towards community and being a good community member. But what happens to identity when you are far away from your tribe or community?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that is one thing that a lot of people are really trying to push towards. They're trying to push towards that, the community belonging as something. Um, I haven't really necessarily noticed that. We have people, in my research that have identified, okay, I'm like this, I'm an urban native, but like this is my tribe type of thing. And so there are people who will, profess the challenges with being, growing up or in an urban environment. Like I'm one of them. It's like it's very hard. Like it takes it's not hard. It is hard, but like it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of effort to plan out to make sure I'm at Oyenque for the events I need to go be there for. It's simply just a challenge. And for a lot of tribes, if you are place-based, it's going to be something where, okay, you are part of it, but to be part of community, to be a good member of the community, be respected there, you have to come back. And so those are things that you kind of have to look at. Um, I think I think that does create a little bit of tension for a lot of people growing up necessarily, but like even say like folks, I would say like even for college students though, even though they don't identify as living and moving away, college students at the University of Arizona, I mean, even if you're Navajo, you are living 5-6 hours away from your homes if you grow up on the res, and so it's not exactly an easy way to get up there. For the most part, you live in Tucson, Arizona for 9 months of the year, and then you come back, and then that's just kind of part of it. So how do you balance living away and going away and being told go get your education, and then also be a good member of your community as you grow up in that important time. So I've seen some of that relationship, and I know that's something that a lot of folks like Gabe Galanda have talked about, and I know that's something that people really push for. But I think with how urban the native population in the United States is, and how there were so many forced migrations, I think we also have to consider, okay, how do we also get people and encourage them to come back? We can't just focus on only the people who live on the res. We know then we have a ton of people living off the res. How do we get them to feel comfortable to want to come back? And so I think that's something that tribal nations that need to consider going forward as well. But like possibly Yaqui tribe, for example, they do outreach events to the various Yaqui communities throughout the Southwest and in California, not even the ones that are not in their reservations. And they, have their council go out and visit with these communities and make sure they feel welcome. It's a very wonderful thing. So we see.
Okay, and we are just about at 5 o'clock here, but I have one more question if you're willing.
Mhm.
And the question is, with the advent of consumer DNA tests, a misconception has emerged that DNA spit tests can be used to gain tribal enrollment, and no federally recognized tribes in the US currently allow this. What are your thoughts on this type of technology for individuals who may not have records of ancestry or lineage that are documented by the federal government?
Yeah, so I think it kind of like stops with, what are the laws of the tribe? People can claim whatever they really want to claim. We're kind of going to be like, you're always going to see that. You're always going to see that in the United States. People want to claim whatever they want. But, it is ultimately at the end of the day, you are, whether you're able to be enrolled or not, or whether you can find that information or not. And so there might be efforts in the future. Maybe there will be tribes that want to see, like, understand, like, maybe they want to, evaluate the role of DNA testing for how they can, do stuff within their tribal enrollment laws. But right now, like you said, there's not really anything right now. So I think for the most part, it's just kind of a novelty. I think it's something to be warned about. I think it's more like maybe you shouldn't give your DNA over to random groups, but we'll just kind of wait and I just think it's something where we have to kind of wait and see. Right now, maybe if there's a tribe that goes out there and starts to like dabble in it, maybe. But right now, since nobody does, I don't think there's really anything else out there. I think the biggest thing with that is more like how like folks, how like people who, the pretendian problem, where it's like folks like Liz Warren, well, instead of discussing with Cherokee Nation, she'll just say, oh, I did a DNA test with this research group, and they said I'm between this and this. And I'm like, and it's just like, okay, but you have a very clear way to go work with the tribe you're trying to affiliate with. Why don't you just go with them? And so I think it's that kind of thing there.
Okay. Becky, I see you're on. Do you want to say anything to William?
Well, I actually have a lot of questions, so I might just end up having to email you, but I was just, thinking about, the relationship with the urban Indians, versus the ones that were raised on the res, and part of that relationship when they go to the universities, and thinking about that connection with who they are is really kind of interesting. But then, there's also, this whole thing that was brought up besides that question was, what we call like descendants of the kids and people who are not tribally enrolled within the tribe. So using that term descendants, but still being able to have a card to be able to identify being native,
Mm.
uh, is really kind of interesting, but then it's also a little necessary with, ICE coming in and taking native people. It's like, at the same time, it's like, okay, they take them because they say they're from Mexico, but, and they're saying, no, we're Indian. So how do they prove that the people who get picked up are Mexican? You
Right.
know, it's
Yeah.
just, it's one of those problems too, where it's, yeah, that the whole blood quantum thing, and just, kids who, kids and adults also who are descendant of the community, that raises another big question.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you that was great. It was really interesting.
I echo that. William, we appreciate your time oh so much, and thank you for presenting on the Discover Archaeology webinar series. If anybody has any additional questions for Will, feel free to email us and we'll pass them on to him and we'll get your questions answered. Will, we wish you the best of luck with your graduation coming up and your dissertation research. And thank you again for all of your insights and your efforts. And we will talk to everybody soon. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune in again next Thursday for a webinar at 4 o'clock Mountain Time. All right, take care, everyone.
Everyone. You.